Hello, everyone. This is Janet Polo with the Colorado Water Congress. Thank you for listening in on our If Water Falls from the Sky, Why Isn't It Free webinar. The Water Congress is proud to offer webinars and workshops as benefits to our members and Colorado's water community. You can learn more about the Colorado Water Congress and upcoming events at www.cowatercongress.org. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First off, I'd like to thank our presenters and our members. These presentations are made possible by your support. The format of this webinar will be as follows. Mr. Rick Jardina will be our first presenter, followed by Professor Chuck Howe. The two will then have a follow-up discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our presenters at rgiardina@raftelis.com and charles.howe@colorado.edu. Mr. Jardina is a certified public accountant and has over 37 years of managerial and financial experience serving utilities in both the private and public sectors. He has completed financial planning and rate studies for some of the largest utility providers in the country and has served as an arbitrator and expert witness in several rate litigation matters. He is currently chair of the AWWA Rates and Charges Committee and chaired the editorial committee and the working group that produced in June of 2012 the 6th edition of the AWWA M1 Manual, Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. In 2011, he was appointed to the EPA Environmental Financial Advisory Board, and in 2013 was reappointed to a second term. Chuck Howe is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Colorado Boulder and a member of the Environment and Society Research Program that he directed from 1986 through 1997. He started water research at Purdue University and served as director of the Water Resources Program at Resources for the Future, Washington, D.C. from 1965 to 1970. He was co-editor of Water Resources Research from 1967 through 1974 and is a fellow of the American Geophysical Union and of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. UCOWR recognized him as a friend of UCOWR and awarded him the Warren A. Hall Medal. He has served as consultant on interstate river conflicts for New Mexico and Texas and on water planning in several countries. Mr. Jardina and Professor Howe will guide us through the complex world of water revenue as we ask, what water bills should we pay for specifically? Without further ado, I will pass it off to Rick Jardina.
Thank you, Shanae. I'd like to start this discussion by providing some background, really almost a primer on rate making. And I'm going to take about 20 minutes to do that. And as was introduced, our goal here is twofold: to provide you with this background information, really focused on the question, what's in your water mix? And then secondly, to introduce an alternative concept, perhaps a new way of thinking about what should in fact be in your water rates given goals of water use efficiency, for example. So let me begin with what I've termed Rate Making 101. And why should we start here? Well, I think it's important to develop a foundation from both a historic and really a current perspective of the rate setting process. And as we look at local government utilities around Colorado and around the country, and really look at the information, the data that forms that foundation of the rates and charges that they assess their customers on typically a monthly basis based on metered water use. So I'd like to begin with some background on industry practices. And there are a variety of sources that can be looked at going back decades in terms of principles of utility rate making. But what I'd like to focus on are two of the current and, in my opinion, fundamental sources of information that anyone can look to with regards to the development of water rates. The first one, as Shanae mentioned when she was talking about my resume, is the American Water Works Association Manual M1, Principles of Rates, Fees, and Charges. This is a document which has evolved over the last 50 years to the current 6th edition and provides, again, in my opinion, information regarding industry guidelines and practices for the development of water rates. And this manual speaks to the beginning of that process in terms of the definition of your revenue requirements, the costs that should be in your rates, and the entire process then going through cost of service onto the design of rates. There's a second document that I also want to mention. It's listed here, the Comprehensive Guide to Water and Wastewater Finance and Process and Pricing. And this is in its 4th edition. The original author is George Raftelis. And George now has probably 20 different people from the industry who provide input and co-author this book, which again, like the M1, is a great resource to those of you who are interested in looking at the current industry practices with regards to the development of water, and in the case of this book, wastewater rates. So I would encourage those of you that want to take a deeper dive to go to both of these books. Let me shift and talk a little bit about standards. And what I've tried to do here is list those that I typically encounter through the course of litigation, those that you will typically see in both of the aforementioned books that I've discussed. And these are the standards that every local utility should look at. And a distinction here drawn between privately owned utilities that fall under Public Utility Commission regulation and local government utilities who truly only answer to their city council absent litigation brought by customers, and in some cases, in some states, PUC regulation over outside city service. But you will find these terms typically used, that rates should not be set in an arbitrary and capricious manner, that we seek at every opportunity to connect the service provided to the customer and the cost associated with that service in the development of rates. That we often want to look at what is known and measurable, as opposed to what I might refer to as pie in the sky capital improvements that may or may not be done in the future. And then, of course, this last one related to the provision of water service. We should not be seeking to charge our water customers through their monthly bill amounts that get transferred to other uses that have nothing to do with the provision of water service. So as you examine your rates and you look at this revenue requirement definition, what should be in your rates, these standards that I've listed here are things that you ought to look to on a regular basis, whether it's from the manual I've mentioned or in discussions with your own attorneys and a full awareness of the legal implications in your particular state. When we speak about water and sewer rates, we're really talking about two typical charges. The first being what I refer to here as a service charge per account. And at a minimum, this service charge should include many of the items I've listed here that could often be considered as customer-related costs, regardless of whether or not a gallon of water moves through that meter. What are the costs that the utility incurs? And those costs have to do with meter reading, meter maintenance, the establishment of customer service personnel who are there to respond to customer inquiries. And so those are typically costs that we would include in the service charge. But we would also look to include other, what I might call baseline capital costs that, again, we incur whether or not a gallon of water is used. And these might also be referred to as readiness to serve costs. And that could include portions of your distribution system, direct fire protection, as I mentioned here. Then the second part of the charges to our customers would be a volume rate. Typically, a volume rate per 1,000 gallons, it could be measured in terms of 100 of cubic feet. And this is where we would include all other costs. And there can be a variety of volume rate structures, volume rate designs, ranging from a uniform rate where, regardless of the amount of use, the same rate applies, to more progressive approaches that really try to influence demand through pricing, try to influence efficient water use. And these approaches typically have a inclining block or an increasing price approach to them, where the more you use through different consumption blocks, the more the customer pays. And again, this is where you would include all costs not recouped through the service charge. And just by example, I've listed several here on this slide. I mentioned earlier the process of developing rates. And this diagram illustrates that 5-step process where, in the very first step, a community, a local government, a utility, would go through that process of identifying pricing objectives, financial and pricing objectives. And these might include things like encouraging conservation, encouraging efficient water use, and also revenue and rate stability. So that's an important element, and the first step in identifying cost is to really look at what's your goal as a community. Do you have goals related to encouraging economic development in addition to conservation and water use efficiency? Is affordability a concern of yours? And the rate structure can be used to help influence these objectives. We then move into the next stages of the process, which really look at identifying revenue requirements, allocating costs, step 4, designing rates, and then ultimately, like most processes, you want to go back and assess how effective you've been in meeting your pricing objectives and recovering your cost. We want to focus on step 2, identifying revenue requirements, and an element of that is demand projections. Really, of our product, of our service, how much of that are we going to provide, and what is the associated cost of that? That's really the definition of revenue requirements. And again, it's driven by the first part of that statement. How much of our service or our product are we going to provide? How many gallons of water are we going to be selling? How many accounts are we going to serve? That's a primary driver in the identification of revenue requirements. This particular slide provides an overview of that process, starting with the various data sources that we look at that drive and help influence our determination of revenue requirements, moving then into or using that data in the development of a financial plan, right then through cost of service, and then ultimately rate design. That financial plan element of the process really tells us how much we need. What is the total dollars that we need to operate a sustainable utility? And this drives really then what's in your rates. Cost of service, that next step, is a process by which we can then identify which of our customers should pay. What customer classes really drive the cost of service? And that could be distinguished across residential, multifamily, commercial customers, irrigation-only accounts. And all of these different customer classes have different service characteristics and then ultimately bear a different proportion or responsibility for the recovery of our revenue requirements. And then finally, the question becomes, once we've identified how much a given class should pay, the next question is rate design. And how does that customer class pay? And again, this goes back to that service charge and that volume rate that I was speaking of. And using those components to determine how different customers would pay for the identified costs to serve that customer class to serve those customers. So this really requires a fair amount of rigor in your process to really look at the source data and defining your revenue requirements and making that determination as to really what should be in your rates. And so I want to go back to that step and really speak to this question of what's in your rates. Here, most typically, local governments operate under a cash basis approach in terms of how they define their budget. And by looking at the budget, we're looking forward. We're looking at next year's costs. And typically financial plans are developed over multiple years, but we typically look at developing rates on an annual basis, starting with budget information that is influenced by historic spending levels that might be derived from what I refer to here as the CAFR under the data column, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, the Capital Improvement Program, the CIP, and then ultimately customer bills. All of these shape what we anticipate our costs to be. And the budget would include our estimated cash outlay for such things as water purchases, power and chemicals. Of course, a significant component of our costs have to do with our own staffing and the resources associated with that. To the extent we've incurred debt to fund our capital needs, we have annual debt service payments. And then these are all further influenced by our own financial metrics that ensure that we're a solvent, sustainable entity. All of those things are appropriate to include in the determination of your rates. And as a local government utility, your obligation to your ratepayers is to include appropriate costs that ensure you can operate on a going concern level that reflect your cost of service. And again, going back to my definition of a cash basis utility, how much are we going to spend in the next year in order to serve our customer base, in order to acquire the resources that we need to acquire? And then that then becomes the foundation, the starting point for the next two steps that we previously talked about, cost of service and developing rates. So in a nutshell, the rates that you develop should be reflective of your anticipated cost, that's your budget, and the outlay that you expect to have with regard to all of these different components of cost that I've mentioned. And that becomes the starting point for your foundation. As I've said, this is a forward-looking approach versus looking at an historic test year, which in regulated utilities, that's often a requirement. But in the local government arena, we have, in my opinion, the advantage of looking forward and basing our costs on the estimates that we have for the next year. And those dollars that are in your rates are a direct reflection of the cost you're going to incur, you anticipate incurring in the next year to serve your customers. So with that backdrop, with that foundation, that's the conclusion of my segment of the presentation. I'm very excited now to get on to the next element of discussion that Professor Howe is going to walk us through. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chuck.
Well, thank you, Rick. Very happy to be here to discuss these interesting issues with you and Shanae, and looking forward to our give and take as we complete our formal presentations. I've worked on water demand and rate structures at various points in my career, and I do appreciate the good work that Rick and his colleagues are doing in assisting towns and other water agencies in putting together efficient financial packages and price structures that make sense. Let me interject just a paragraph, so to speak, concerning our Western water law, through which we obtain rights to the use of water from the various sources, reservoirs, rivers, groundwater, and so on. In the Western United States, we have a system of water law that establishes by which a user can establish a right to the use of water from a reservoir, a lake, a river, or from the underground by starting that use and then registering that use with a court, which is called a water court. And having done that, that user has a water right that specifies where the water comes from, how much can be used, during what times of the year, and so on, the water can be used. These water rights are considered personal property of the user, and in fact can be bought and sold. And we do have a very active set of water markets, state by state, through the western United States, in which water rights are exchanged. And these water rights have become very valuable. New slide, please. Try the next slide. As an example of the value of water rights, let me point to the Colorado Big Thompson project in north central Colorado, which diverts water from the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, where snow accumulates, over to the east slope, where most the heavy demands are made on that water supply. The shares in the Colorado Big Thompson project have become very, very valuable. Cutting through some of the numbers here, that let me point out that the market value here in the eastern slope of Colorado, the market value for a raw water, that is untreated water, not distributed, but from some central source, has a market value around $7 a thousand gallons. It doesn't mean that everybody has to pay $7 a thousand gallons, but it implies that water that we're using has alternative uses that have a value of something around $7 a thousand gallons as we think about the prices that we want to put on water, especially in the urban context. Change of slide, please. Several years ago, I made an estimate of the value of the water rights that are held by Boulder in order to acquire water and serve their customers. And a few years ago, that value was around $400 million. Now, these are assets, valuable assets, but they are seldom recognized as assets on which the utility could earn a rate of return. If 5% of this value were recognized as an annual recoverable cost, it might add something like $1.50 for each 1,000 gallons in each step of the rate structure, or increase the monthly bill of the customer something like $15. But the reasonable attitude is, well, look, we're very lucky. We have these water rights. Our grandparents managed to acquire the water rights, establish the water rights, and it doesn't cost anything to hold on to those water rights. Why should we ask customers to pay anything in addition to the costs that Rick has so nicely outlined in his presentation? Well, from a local point of view, that is a reasonable, rational point of view. But from a regional point of view, the traditional accounting approach ignores the value of the raw water that's being used. And as a result, raw water that has a very high value, perhaps as much as $7 per 1,000 gallons, is used by the customers in low value uses, such as hosing off the sidewalks and overwatering the lawn. So that what we have as we approach these financing and pricing questions is a conflict between a local point of view and judgment about how the system should be run and priced, and the regional judgment that looks at the broader use of water by all water users throughout the region. Next slide, please. We have, well, if indeed, contrary to existing practices that Rick has been describing, if we in fact introduce the value of the raw water as a cost to be reflected in the prices to the consumer, we're going to end up with a much higher revenue, and that revenue would not be justified under the traditional counting of costs and allowable costs that are typically allowed, let's say, by a Public Utility Commission. If that's the case, then we would end up having to return to the customers a good deal of the excess revenue generated. But it would result in a rate structure that reflects more accurately to the customer the actual value, cost of the water, the actual cost of the water that we're using. So my proposal is, though, that we include in the cost structure to be incorporated in the rates charged customers the value of the raw water that's being used. With that, I'll stop my presentation, but perhaps I could toss a question to Rick, and I greatly appreciate his presentation, but let me pose a question to Rick as a start of back and forth between the two of us, perhaps. There's a classic conundrum in the water pricing situation that in a period of drought, we always urge our customers to cut back, to conserve on water, to cut back on their water use. But when the volume falls, the revenues accumulated by the water utility fall, and then in order to cover budgeted costs, the utility finds itself having to raise rates. At the same time, they have already requested reductions in use by their customers. So how do we deal with this? How do we avoid this conundrum of asking people to conserve and then raising the price to them? Over.
Chuck, that's a great question, and I'm sure many of those folks who listen to this will have experienced the same problem. For years and years, we had as a focus water use efficiency and conservation. And it's one of those things that finally, we ask folks to do this long enough and they respond, or as you said, we're in an emergency situation in a drought. And folks conserve, but yet we then have to turn around and raise their rates. Well, the issue there is the fact that these utilities are largely fixed cost entities. For most water utilities, anywhere from 70 to 80, 85% of their costs are fixed. And to the extent as Chuck described, as you described, water use goes down, revenues go down, our costs don't go down in a corresponding manner. So the real issue here is looking at alternatives to try to insulate the utility from these kinds of revenue variability, given their fixed cost model. So what we have seen is a number of utilities strike a better balance in the degree of revenues that they receive from their fixed charge, or what I called earlier a service charge, compared to their volumetric rates. And to try to do so without losing ground on the advances made through pricing to achieve conservation. And this is always a very difficult question, a difficult balance to strike. So we have seen utilities move from that level of generating 5 to 10% of their revenue through fixed charges to increasing them to 15, 20, 25%. And of course, in this kind of a market or in this kind of a model, the trade-off is you would then lower what you generate through your volume rates. But you would try to do that in a way that doesn't, again, lose the ground that we've made with regard to pricing efficiency. So what you would attempt to do is to lower your block 1, your block 2 rates under a tiered approach, but increase or maintain the level of your economic incentive rates, the higher rates that you charge customers who use excessive amounts of water. That's one alternative. Additionally, we've seen utilities create revenue stability funds so that in that period where we're asking customers to conserve and the revenues go down, we don't have to turn around and raise rates. What we do is we dip into and we use some of these previously accumulated funds to try to avoid exactly the situation, Chuck, that you've talked about. Another alternative is more conservative demand forecasting, not projecting usage as high as we have in the past and putting the utility in a more fiscally conservative posture. I've talked about 3 or 4 examples of things that utilities can do. Not any one of these is the answer, and for each of your utilities, you need to look at what's going to work best given your customer base, given your source of supply, and given your cost structure. Chuck, let me turn the table and throw a question your way if I could. When you talk about this water rate proposal and adding the cost of water rights, the value of water rights into the rate structure, how would you reconcile that proposal with the fact that most customers, when they connected to the system, paid an impact fee or a plant investment fee, and that was reflective of, in this case, the Boulder example, that was reflective of the cost, the cost or the current value of that Colorado Big Thompson water that the city of Boulder went out and acquired so they could serve that new customer. How would you reconcile that in terms of we paid through the plant investment fee, but now we may also be paying a higher rate for the same asset?
Well, this is a good question, and I appreciate your very clear comments on the importance of the volumetric charges, because the volumetric charges are what the customer looks at, perhaps sees as they use more or less water. And I think a greater emphasis on the volumetric charges is important. I think you've implied that. With regard to the issue that a customer, when coming onto the system, is typically required to pay perhaps quite substantial plant investment fee, and that provides the necessary financing for the system, for its expansion, for the acquisition of water rights. But once paid, these payments really do not have a continuing impact on the behavior of the customer. What impacts the customer's behavior day by day, month by month, through the summer are the volumetric charges. So that what we really need to look at in terms of most effective water use is to reflect in the charges to the customer the the full cost, including the scarcity value of the water that is providing their use.
I think that's a great comment, and sort of leads to maybe another question I have. And I think one way to do that is in this tiered or volumetric rate approach I've talked about that places like Boulder and many Colorado communities have. One thing we've seen is taking that marginal cost of water, and going back to your example, if the value of a Colorado Big Thompson share today is $7 per thousand, using that marginal cost or current value as the price of that upper tier of water, what would be your thoughts with regard to that? That, as long as we reconcile to our total cash revenue requirements, I think we could maybe address both of our concerns by setting the highest tier use of water at that marginal cost of $7, which would, because we're going to be generating more revenue there, we could then lower the tier 1 and 2 prices potentially and still recover our cash basis revenue requirements and accomplish that pricing incentive that I think you're striving for. Does that have some appeal or merit, Chuck?
Oh, I think your suggestion is right on. Those large volume users who find themselves at the high steps of the rate structure are typically also what we call peak period users. That is, they come in during the summer, during the time of day when the water supply system is really straining its capacity. And as a result, the large volume users also place pressure on the system for additional capacity expansion. So the costs attributable to those high volume users in the upper steps of the rate structure, those costs really are quite high. I think you've asked a question too. Well, what about the equity? I don't think we need to worry about the high value users, but the question you have raised about what about lower income individuals being faced with increasing prices? And this is always a tough issue to address. We do have low income water users who are usually found in the first few steps of the water rate structure. And I think you suggested that the higher rates of the large users who do impose these capacity costs on the system, that those additional revenues can basically be used to reduce the rates that are being charged in the first steps of the rate structure, which likely correspond to lower income individuals. So I think you've described quite a workable and equitable situation. Over to you.
Yeah, I think so, and that's going to be an increasing challenge that we see for local government utilities is this affordability question. And one of the related challenges to that has to do with identifying those customers that are most at risk. And what we most often see is this notion that if I'm a low volume customer, then boy, I must also be a low income customer. And I'm not dismissing that premise, but I think what we also find is that we can have large volume users because of the number of people per household, for example, who are also facing the affordability challenge. And so a number of communities are looking very closely at how they should design their rates, as well as other sources, other resources in their community that their customers can turn to should they have affordability issues. And I think most folks would be surprised at the number of resources that exist out there that customers avail themselves of when it comes to paying their electric and natural gas bills. And it can be a balance for the local government to identify those outside sources, encourage folks to go there, as well as look internal to how they might wrestle with affordability issues. So I think that is a growing issue as we move forward as well.
Your response is excellent, Rick. Looking towards those other sources rather than distorting the prices of water raises an issue that has been faced in economics and the pricing of urban services for a long, long time. To what extent do you want to distort the prices of a given service, in this case water, or shouldn't there be other ways of dealing with the needs of let's say, low-income customers? And you've put your finger right on it that there are other sources, and we shouldn't try to deal with income inequality situations by distorting the price of water.
I would echo what you said. My first preference is to maintain that economic principle, and that there's a cost to the service provided, and signals and messages that can be sent through the rate structure. And if we can find opportunities, resources outside of the pricing structure of water, that should be our first turn. Right.
No, that makes good sense, I think, from a point of view of good economic principles. Let me just pose one additional quick question. I don't know how much time we have, but this is a question of using smart readers. I know here in Boulder, we have introduced a system of smart readers, that is, meters that let the user know what they're using today and what they're paying. And the question is, of course, this is additional information for the typical water user. How effective have these so-called smart readers been found to be?
Another great question, because when we talk about price incentives, I think we would all agree the more information we can give our customers, then the greater opportunity they have to react to that. And so my experience has been, because I started my career in the electric and natural gas industry, and I've been in the water side for many, many years now. But what I've observed is that the water industry tends to lag anywhere 10, 15 years behind the electric and natural gas industry in a variety of areas, whether it has to do with conservation, whether it has to do with demand forecasting, and to your question now, metering. And so we saw in the electric industry time of day demand metering. And I can remember my brother had a house where he had time of day electric meter. And it would actually tell him when his demand went above a certain level. We'd go around the house at the holidays when we were all there, turning off lights so that he didn't incur a demand charge. Now, we will have that kind of information on the water side as we move forward. We're very close to it, and the question you're asking is, what do we do with that data? What do we do with it from a point of view of looking at real-time data for customers in the design of their rates? What do the customers do with that data when I can look at my smartphone and I can see right now how much water I'm using, or I can get information how much I've used this billing cycle, where I'm falling within the pricing structure of my local utility? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here to provide that information to customers. And I'll back up to what I said a moment ago, that I think we as rate practitioners and local government utilities, we're going to have an opportunity to really look at how best to use this information. Yes, to communicate with customers, but equally important, if not more important, to design rates that could potentially become individualized rates based on how each customer uses water throughout their billing cycle, throughout the day. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to look at rate design options, but just the notion of the customer being able to look at their smartphone or on their computer and see where they are in terms of using water that might put them into that next threshold. And then they can make those kinds of decisions, Chuck, that you've talked about. Do I want to use that water and pay that price? So I think we're sort of on the precipice here of being able to better communicate with our customers, more effectively communicate. And in this business of designing rates and deciding how much or what should be in your rates, data is king. And we're going to be getting a whole lot more information to allow us to make these kinds of really informed decisions.
Those comments are very encouraging, Rick, that these data can be used to fashion, you suggested, maybe even individual rate structures, but however fine that might go, the possibility of reflecting to the customer the costs that they are putting on the system, and perhaps on an individual customer basis, is just a very, very exciting development, going way beyond our early notions about peak period pricing, but becoming much more specific to the individual customer. We haven't talked about, we've been talking largely in terms of domestic, that is to say household water use, and we could get into another session with regard to industrial or agricultural water uses. But the proposals you've made are very exciting, and I think I'm about at the end of my concerns at this point in time, folks.
Yeah, I would echo your comments, Chuck. This has been a great discussion. And Shanae, I think if you have any closing comments, we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you both for participating in this presentation. Again, I will just say, if you have any questions for either one of our presenters, please refer to the initial slide where you will find their contact information. Thank you.